Yes. It is up to us, then, as founders of the city, to compel the best natures to get as far as that study which we said earlier was the most important, to make that ascent and view the good. And when they have made it, and seen all they need to see, we must not allow them to do what they are allowed to do at the moment. What is that? Remain there, I said, and refuse to come back down again to the prisoners we were talking about, or share in their hardships and rewards, be they trivial or substantial. That seems very unfair. Are we going to make them live a worse life when it is in their power to live a better one? Now it's your turn to have forgotten, my friend, that the law does not exist for the exclusive benefit of one class in the city. Its aim is to engineer the benefit of the city as a whole, using persuasion and compulsion to bring the citizens into harmony and making each class share with the other classes the contribution it is able to bring to the community. The law is what puts people like this in the city, and it does so not with the intention of allowing each of them to go his own way, but so that it can make use of them for its own purposes, to bind the city together. True, he said, I had forgotten that. In which case, Glaucon, you should bear in mind that we won't after all be doing an injustice to those who become philosophers in our city. There will be justice in what we say to them when we compel them to look after and guard what belongs to other people. It is fair enough, we shall say to them, for philosophers in other cities not to take a share of the work in those cities. Their philosophy is a spontaneous growth which arises despite the institutions of the particular city they live in, and what has developed naturally, indebted to nobody for its upbringing, is entitled to be unenthusiastic about paying anyone for its upbringing. But with you, it's different. We produced you as guides and rulers, both to yourselves and to the rest of the city, like leaders or kings in a hive of bees. You have been better and more fully educated than the rest, and are better able to play your part in both types of life. So you must go down, each of you in turn, to join the others in their dwelling place. You must get used to seeing in the dark, and when you do get used to it, you will see 1,000 times better than the people there do. You will be able to identify all the images there, and know what they are images of, since you have seen the truth of what is beautiful and just and good. In this way, the government of the city, for us and for you, will be a waking reality rather than the kind of dream in which most cities exist nowadays, governed by people fighting one another over shadows and quarrelling with one another about ruling, as if ruling were some great good. The truth is, I imagine, that the city in which those who are to rule are most reluctant to do so will inevitably be the city which has the best and most stable government, whereas the city with rulers of the opposite kind will have a government of the opposite kind. Exactly, he said. Will they disobey us then, do you think, these people we have brought up? Will they refuse to do their share of work in the city, each group in its turn, even though they can still spend most of their time in each other's company in the clear air above? They can't possibly refuse. It's a just demand, and they are just people. But they will undoubtedly approach ruling, each one of them, as something unavoidable, just the opposite of the people who rule in every city at the moment. That's right, my friend. It's like this. If you can find a better life than ruling for the people who are going to be your rulers, then your well-governed city becomes a possibility. It will be the only city ruled by those who are truly rich, not rich in money, but in a good and wise life. The rich is needed for good fortune. If you get beggars, people who are starved of good things in their own lives, going into public life because they believe that the good is something to be taken from there as plunder, then your city is not a possibility. Ruling becomes something to be fought over, and a war of this kind, domestic and internal, destroys both those involved in it and the rest of the city with them. Very true, he said. All right, then. Can you think of any life, apart from the life of true philosophy, which has a contempt for public office? Good heavens, no. But ruling must be courted only by those who are not in love with her. Otherwise, They will have rival suitors to contend with. Of course. And if you're going to compel people to enter upon the guardianship of the city, who better than those who are wisest in these matters, in what will give the city the best government, and who have their own rewards and their own way of life, better than the political? There is no one better, he said. Very well, Glaucon. The agreed characteristics of the city which is to reach the peak of political organization are community of women, community of children and the whole system of education, community likewise of everyday life, both in wartime and peacetime, and the kingship of those among them who have developed into the best philosophers, and the best when it comes to war. Yes, he said, those are the agreed characteristics. What is more, we also agreed that when the rulers assume power, they will take the soldiers and move them to housing of the kind we described earlier, common to all of them, and offering no private property to anyone. And in addition to the nature of their housing, we even reached agreement, if you recall, on the kind of possessions they will have. I do recall. We thought that none of them should have any of the possessions which most people nowadays have. They should be guardians and warrior athletes of some sort, receiving from the rest of the citizens, as annual pay for their guardianship, just as much maintenance as they need for this purpose. Their duty would be to protect themselves and the rest of the city. You're right, I said. But after we'd finished dealing with all that, can we remember the point where we began this digression, so that we can carry on from the same place? That's easy enough, he said. You were talking in pretty much the way you're talking now, as if you had completed your account of the city. You were saying you regarded the kind of city you had just described, and the individual who resembled it, as a good one, despite the fact that you apparently had an even better city and individual to tell us about. You certainly said that if this was the right sort of city, then the others must have something wrong with them. And you said, if I remember rightly, that there were 4 other kinds of regime, or 4 others worthy of discussion at any rate. You said we should look at their faults and at the individuals who resemble them, so that when we had examined all the individuals and reached agreement on which was the best and which was the worst, we could ask whether the best individual is the happiest and the worst the most wretched, or whether that's all a mistake. I asked you which 4 regimes you meant, but then Polemarchus and Adeimantus interrupted, and that started you on the discussion which has brought you here. What an excellent memory. In that case, try and give me the answer you were going to give me then. Certainly, I said, assuming I can, that is. Apart from anything else, I have reasons of my own for wanting to know which 4 regimes you meant. There will be no difficulty in telling you that. They even have names, the ones I'm talking about. There's the one which is pretty generally approved, the Cretan or Spartan. Next, and next in the scale of general approval, is the one called oligarchy, a form of government filled with all sorts of evils. In contrast to oligarchy, and the form of government which in turn arises out of it, is democracy. And then there is the wonderful institution of tyranny, standing head and shoulders above all the others, the 4th and last diseased state of the city. Can you think of any other kind of regime which forms a distinct category of its own? I take it that hereditary rule by families, kingships which go to the highest bidder, and other similar regimes, which you will find are no less common among the barbarians than among the Greeks, are all intermediate between the forms I have mentioned. Yes, he said, we certainly do hear about plenty of extraordinary regimes. Well then, are you aware that for individuals also there must necessarily be as many kinds of character as there are kinds of regime? Or do you think that regimes somehow come into being from oak or stone? Isn't it rather from the characters of people in the city which tip the scale, as it were, taking the rest with them? No, I think it's entirely the character of the inhabitants. In which case, if there are 5 types of city, then for individuals there will likewise be 5 dispositions of the soul. Of course. Well, we have finished describing the person who resembles aristocracy, and we say quite rightly that he is good and just. Yes, we have described him. Is the next thing, then, to describe the ones who are less good, the lover of victory and honour, who corresponds to the Spartan regime, and then in turn the oligarchic character, the democratic, and the tyrannical. That way we can contrast the most unjust, when we find him, with the most just. Our investigation into how pure justice fares relative to pure injustice, in terms of the happiness or wretchedness of the person who possesses it, will be complete. And we can either follow Thrasymachus's advice and pursue injustice, or follow the argument which is unfolding before us now, and pursue justice. Yes, he said, that's exactly what we have to do. All right, then. Shall we start by taking a look at the honour-loving regime timocracy, or timachy, followed by oligarchy? After that we can turn to democracy, and fourthly we can turn to the city which is ruled by a tyrant, and look at that. Will that be a way of trying to become competent judges of the question we have asked ourselves? It would certainly be a logical way of going about our observations and judgments. Very well. Let's try and describe the way in which timocracy might arise out of aristocracy. Is it a general rule that the cause of change in any regime is to be found in the sovereign body itself, when civil war arises within this group? That as long as this group, however small it may be, remains united, it is impossible for the regime to be altered? Yes, that's true. In that case, Glaucon, how will the regime of our city be altered? How will civil war break out, either between our auxiliaries and our rulers, or among them? Do you want us, like Homer, to invoke the Muses to tell us how first dissension fell upon them? Shall we imagine that they speak to us in high-flown, tragic tones, as if they were playing with little children, and teasing them by pretending to be speaking seriously? What would they say? Something like this. It is no easy matter for a city founded in this way to be altered, but since destruction awaits everything that has come to be, even a foundation of this kind will not survive for the whole of time. It will fall apart, and this will be the manner of its falling. Both for plants in the ground and for animals above the ground, it is a fact that souls and bodies are produced or not produced when the cycles of begetting for each species complete their revolutions. Short revolutions for short-lived species, and the opposite for long-lived species. In the case of your species, wise though the people you have educated as leaders of the city are, still they will not quite hit the mark when they apply calculation, together with observation, to their program of breeding and birth control. Success will elude them, and they will sometimes produce children they should not produce. When your guardians make injudicious unions of brides and grooms, the children will not have the right nature, and they will not be fortunate. The previous generation will select the best of them, but they will not deserve selection, and when they in their turn inherit the powers of their fathers, the first thing they will neglect as guardians will be us, the Muses, since they will put too low a value on musical and literary education. And the second thing they will neglect will be physical education. The result will be a younger generation which has even less regard for us, and from their number rulers will be appointed who completely lack a guardian's ability to discriminate between Hesiod's classes, or the classes in your city, gold, silver, bronze, and iron. When iron is compounded with silver, and bronze with gold, then you will get unlikeness and discordant inequality, and when you get those, wherever they occur, they always breed war and hostility. This is sedition's noble line, we have to say always, and wherever it arises. What else do the Muses have to say? When civil war breaks out, the classes or natures are divided into two. The iron and bronze draw the state towards commerce and the possession of land and housing, of gold and silver. The other pair, by contrast, the gold and silver, lead the state towards virtue and traditional order. In fighting and struggling against one another, they arrive at a compromise. The land and housing is to be divided up and owned privately, and they agree to enslave those who were previously watched over by them as free men, friends and providers. They now hold them as serfs and slaves, while their role is to watch them and conduct warfare. Yes, he said, I think that is the origin of this sort of change. In which case, I said, would this regime be a kind of halfway house between aristocracy and oligarchy? It certainly would. Very well. Will the points it has in common with the original regime be these: respect for the rulers, the disqualification of the warrior element in the state from agriculture, manual employment, or any other kind of business, the establishment of communal living quarters, and the concentration on physical education and training for war? Yes. Whereas feared of putting the wise into positions of power, since the wise men it has are now complex, not simple and direct any more, a leaning towards people who are spirited, more straightforward and naturally cut out for war rather than peace, the value it places on military deceptions and stratagems, the way it spends its entire time at war, will most of these characteristics be peculiar to itself? Yes. Now that they possess their own treasuries and strong rooms where they can put their gold and silver and keep it hidden, people like this will be avaricious, like the members of an oligarchy, with a fierce and secret passion for gold and silver. And to protect it all, they will have walls around their houses, real private nests where they can spend a fortune on women or anyone else they fancy. Very true, he said. The value they put on money and their inability to acquire it openly will make them mean with their own money, while their desires and the secret pleasures they enjoy will make them extravagant with other people's. They will run away from the law like children running away from their father, since their education will not have been a matter of conviction, but something imposed on them by force. This, in turn, is the result of neglecting the true muse, the muse of argument and philosophy, and setting a higher value on physical education than on education in the arts. It's certainly a mixed regime you are describing, partly bad and partly good. Yes, it is a mixture, I said, but it has one striking characteristic which comes from the dominance of the spirited element: love of victory and honour. Absolutely. So much for this regime, then. That's how it would have come into existence, and that's what it would be like. It's just an outline sketch of the regime without filling in the details, but even a sketch will give us a good enough picture of the completely just man and the completely unjust man. It's an impossibly long task to describe every regime and every character without leaving anything out. Quite right, he said. I imagine the next regime would be oligarchy, the regime based on property qualifications, where the rich rule and the poor man is excluded from power. Do we have to explain how the change from timachy to oligarchy first takes place? Yes. The regime we described is destroyed by the strong room full of gold which each man possesses. They start by inventing extravagances for themselves, and this leads them to bend the laws, since neither they nor their wives are prepared to obey them. That's likely enough. The next step, I suppose, will have been for them to start eyeing one another and competing with one another, and in this way they would reduce the whole population to their own level. Very likely. After that, presumably, they would become still further involved in making money, and the higher the value they put on that, the lower the value they would put on virtue. Isn't virtue always at odds with wealth in this way, as if they were in the two scales of a balance, always trying to move in opposite directions? Exactly, he said. And as wealth and the wealthy are more valued in a city, so goodness and the good are valued less. Obviously. What is valued at any particular time becomes the common practice. What is not valued is neglected. Yes. Eventually, then, they stop being competitive and ambitious and become mercenary and money-loving. They praise and admire the rich man and admit him to positions of power. The poor man they treat with contempt. Absolutely. At that point, they pass a law defining the oligarchic regime. They establish a wealth qualification, larger in an extreme oligarchy, smaller in a more moderate oligarchy, and declare that anyone whose property does not reach the prescribed value is debarred from the government. Either they put this into effect by force of arms, or else they've already established this kind of regime earlier by intimidation. Isn't that how it's done? It is. So that, more or less, is how it becomes established. Yes, he said. But what are the characteristics of this regime, and what are the kind of faults we said it possessed? Well, I said, the first fault is this very thing which defines its nature. Think what it would be like if you appointed ship's captains in this way, on the basis of a property qualification, and refused to command to a poor man, even if he was better qualified. I think it would be a sorry voyage they'd find themselves making, he said. And the same with any position of command over anything. That's certainly my opinion. With the exception of a city, or including a city. It is especially true of a city, he said, since the responsibility a city brings is the greatest and the most demanding. This would be one great failing, then, possessed by oligarchy. It looks like it. What about its second failing? Is that any less serious? What would it be, this second failing? That a city of this kind is bound to be two cities, not one. A city of the poor and a city of the rich, living in the same place, but constantly scheming against one another. That is, God knows, as big a failing as the first. You must ask yourself, however, if this city isn't also the first to introduce an evil which is greater than either of these. What evil is that? There is nothing to stop one person selling all his property, and a second person acquiring it. Nothing to stop the first person still living in the city after selling his property without being one of the elements which make up the city. He is neither businessman nor skilled worker, neither cavalryman nor infantryman, just a poor man, what they call a man without means. Yes, he said, this city is the first to introduce this evil. Certainly, in cities with oligarchic regimes, this kind of thing is not prohibited in any way. If it were, you wouldn't get one group of people who were very rich and the rest living in complete poverty. That's right. And here's another point to think about. At the point where someone like this was rich and spending all his money, was he even at that time any use to the city for the purposes we've been talking about? Or was it an illusion, his being one of the rulers? Was he in truth neither a ruler nor a servant of the city, but merely a spendthrift? Yes, he said, it was an illusion. He was nothing more than a spendthrift. Do you want us to say, then, that just as a drone born in a cell is a blight on the hive, so a man like this is born as a drone in a household and as a blight on the city? By all means, Socrates. Well then, Adamantus, is it the case that God has made the winged variety of drone all stingless, whereas of these two-legged drones, some are stingless, but others have very nasty stings? Do those who finish up as beggars in their old age come from the stingless class, and all those who are labelled criminals come from the class with stings? Yes, that's true, he said. It's obvious, then, that anywhere in a city you see beggars, there you can expect to find a secret nest of thieves, pickpockets, robbers of temples, and all these sorts of malefactors. Yes, that's obvious. And don't you find beggars in cities with oligarchic regimes? Yes, practically the whole population apart from the rulers. Can we avoid the conclusion, then, that in these cities there is a large number of criminals with stings, and that the authorities systematically and forcibly keep them under control? No, we can't, he said. And can we not say that the cause of people like this coming into existence there is lack of education, together with poor upbringing and constitutional arrangements? Yes, we can. Well, that's roughly what the oligarchic city would be like, and those are the evils it would contain, plus some others besides, perhaps. Yes, that's about it. Then that's another regime we can regard as dealt with, the one known as oligarchic, whose rulers are chosen on the basis of a property qualification.